Everybody likes Crimson, right? I like Crimson, and in case you weren't aware, it's one of a very small handful of weapons that have the ability to heal the wielder. I thought, since the weapon is starting to see a lot of usage in PvP as of late, I may as well take an in-depth look at it and give it a good old-fashioned universal review, both PvE and PvP. It sees the majority of its usage in PvP mostly, especially as of late, and for a multitude of reasons. One of the largest selling points here, in my own opinion at the very least, is that it's got a stability stat of 97. This is abnormally high, especially when you take into consideration that its recoil direction sits at a 55, and it literally goes straight up. The only thing that's going to cause you to miss with Crimson is if you underestimate the total recoil after a full burst. The firing animation and the optics itself tend to get in the way of your center of vision depending on the ornament that you're using, and it can 100% cause you to lose a target and, inevitably, a gunfight. Because of that, avoid iridescent death. It looks cool, yes, but the skull and crossbones on the red dot will cuck you if you let it. Other than that, this is an extremely forgiving gun at the cost of having its damage divided into 3 rounds per shot. Reload time clocks at 2.5 seconds without a loader mod, or rather 2.41 seconds if I'm being specific. Slot a loader mod on there and that number drops to 1.86 seconds, which could be hastened even more with certain abilities and skill trees. Chains of Woe or Tempered Metal both increase a number of different stats. Keep in mind, the reload time is based off of the frames that I recorded, not just some stopwatch I found on the ground. I physically counted the frames from the animation start to the animation end. Now, for the topic of damage, we've got an impact of 92, so at optimal range, it's going to hit for 20 times 3 for a body and 31 times 3 on a critical. That's a total of 60 for body shots, which is 10 points more than a single round from a 120 without any damage modifiers, and 3 points more than a standard 120 at optimal range, assuming you're hitting criticals. That lands this gun close to the 120 archetype in terms of its overall damage, something like Sturm or True Prophecy, or as of late, the Steady Hand. All 3 of those will hit 50 on a body shot at optimal range and 90 on a critical hit, so holding this thing in your hand and pulling the trigger should be a very familiar feeling if you main 120s in PvP. However, there is a catch. Its RPM pushes 415, making it closer to a 140 in terms of rate of fire, and while that would normally mean less flinch per shot, the 3 shots together gives an exceptional amount of stagger potential. But you have to be at optimal range. If you're past 25 meters, it's no different than using a slingshot, so keep that in mind before you pull the trigger. Not only will you fail at max damage potential, but you'll also fail at staggering, because the stagger effect is also split into thirds. If only 1 out of the 3 rounds hits, you are wide open for an attack that will likely cost you a gunfight. Even though it shreds 3 rounds on a single pull of the trigger, the collective damage from all 3 rounds, as I said earlier, actually equates to 10 damage more than a single round from a 120. That makes this gun one of those few exotics that almost falls in between 2 different archetypes, which is unique. It does what an exotic is supposed to do. It bends the rules of the existing weapon archetypes, but instead of setting itself apart, it more or less just kind of sits between 140 and 120, kind of sandwiched in the middle. I feel like this is an extremely solid and reliable gun, seeing that it's incredibly stable and it hits slightly harder than the 120 archetype, but it also has slightly higher aim assist than most 120s as well. It sits at 75. Many 120s tend to sit in the upper 60s, whereas a large amount of 140s tend to sit in the lower 90s. On top of that, once you masterwork it, that range stat jumps up to a 93, making this one a lethal 3-tap at mid-range. If you hit your crits! That's the thing about Crimson. You physically require those critical hits, and you have to be at optimal range, which is roughly 25 meters, or you're just wasting your time. By the time you hit 40 meters, you'll be hitting for 7s instead of 20s, so the best way to handle this gun is to avoid long-range encounters completely. Anything past 25 meters and you're fighting a losing battle most of the time. Range fall-off really starts to kick in at the 30-meter marker, and by the time you hit 35, you're dealing half damage, and aim assist isn't high enough to compensate for that kind of distance. Not without targeting mods at the very least. If it were a single round, it would be a little bit different, but this is a 3-round burst that we're talking about. Your damage is divided into thirds, and the aim assist value is factored into all 3 rounds. If you really want to try pushing range with Crimson, you need hand cannon targeting. Without it, at great enough distances, you'll just end up missing the majority of your shots, or dealing minuscule amounts of damage, and you'll likely lose that gunfight. Everybody handles gunfights differently. I'm more of a laneway kind of player. I don't like to run out in the open and blast everything that I see. me, because I'm not the greatest shot in the world, so that typically ends with me getting outgunned, and let me tell you, it happens a lot, as you can probably see by watching these recordings. That being said, this is a good gun to have if you are able to aim better than myself. I see loads of people using it far better than I can, and having significantly more success than myself. This is actually a great mid-range hand cannon that has the potential to dominate multiple different combat encounters because of the higher base damage and an RPM that is almost identical to a 140, save for mere decimal points. But this is not one of those guns that's just going to aim for you. If you want to actually succeed with it and score with it, you have to understand how to use it and how to play on its strengths, which again are mid-range encounters and back attacks. Catching someone off guard or someone who's already attacking someone else, that is the easiest way to score with Crimson. It's elusive. You really have to know how to move and where to go when trying to make a play with it. I can't actually say that the heal on kill makes any real difference in a gunfight, and I say that because most encounters are based on whether or not you can hit that crit, and even if you do, depending on what mode you're playing, someone else will be right around the corner to finish you off. So whatever you do, don't grab this gun and expect it to be your saving throw, because while the healing is there, it's not the PvP selling point that it looks like it should be. Only a small sliver of health is returned, and if I had to guess, I'd say it's somewhere around a tenth of your full bar. This is not a gun that's meant for ranged combat, not in the slightest. The 3 rounds are handy, but once you're outside optimal range, trying to shoot back can quickly turn into a waste of energy, especially in Rumble where everybody's go-to strategy is Fellwinter. In no universe can a hand cannon compete with a shotgun at 10 meters, and the downside is that if you don't have a stable hand, which I do not, you'll often find yourself losing your target in the recoil. This is the type of gun that you have to break up fights with. You can charge in head-on, but you have to hit those crits. The body damage is nice, but it's still a 4-tap if you don't hit for critical damage, meaning that unless you're hitting targets in the face, it's going to take you 12 rounds to kill another player. This is an awesome gun that can give you an edge in PvP, but ultimately it is a controller gun because of the aim assist, so if you're not on a controller, you're best attacking other players that are busy fighting one another. Getting the jump on someone else is where it excels. Moving on to the side of the game that is significantly more my style, Crimson performs rather well, actually. All the real work here is being done in the Shattered Throne, an Exo Challenge, and a few different lost sectors, so this is all just normal, daily use type of stuff. In the first half of this video, we already went over stats and everything, but for the sake of a quick recap, I'll go over them one more time. Crimson clocks an impact of 92, a masterworked range of 93, a stability of 97, a handling at 42, a reload speed of 64, and a base aim assist of 75. That makes this a rather well-rounded weapon in PvE instances. It is a gun that you can rely on. It feels good in your hands, and it moves. There is no wrangling or arguing with it to make it do what you want it to do, which is a huge plus in PvE considering the exorbitantly high impact for a gun that's technically a 140. Even with a lower base handling stat, this gun still feels like a knife through hot butter. But you have to remember that this is still a hand cannon. This is not a primary damage dealer, not by any means. It doesn't chunk damage, and Cruel Remedy is only really useful in moments with lots of mob crowds. Targets that you can eliminate with ease. This is mostly because the battle healing only restores a small sliver of health, as I mentioned earlier. As with just about every hand cannon, it's not meant to be a real damage dealer. That's what Energy and Heavy is for. This is a crowd clearing gun, nothing more, but the damage that it does do is not weak by any means. See, the higher base damage does carry over into any and all PvE instances. It's difficult to really showcase any sort of example, but I was able to snag a few clips. So you can see here that Crimson crits for 659 times 3 against the Labyrinth Architect without any external buffs or mods to boost its damage. These are decent hits for a hand cannon. I mean, it's nothing incredible in terms of overall damage because Hawkmoon exists, but this isn't bad. This is decent. This is good. Directly after that, you can see that the Steady Hand crits for 1947, also without any mods or buffs. The damage increase from Steady Hand to Crimson is so unbelievably slight that it almost doesn't really make that much of a difference. A single burst from Crimson adds up to only 1977. That's only 30 points of damage more than a single crit from the Steady Hand. But that's just a single boss target. It's also entirely possible that it's just an awkward scaling here, so let's take it into a standard lost sector and take a closer look. First up, we've got the Steady Hand, which crits for 3592 at optimal range. No unstable essence, no nothing, just straight damage. Next, we've got Crimson, which crits for 1217 times 3, also without unstable essence and no external buffs. This time, it's only an extra 59 damage. You can likely see what I mean. mean here. The damage buff is there, but it is extremely slight. Subtle enough to where you wouldn't even really be able to notice unless you went back and physically looked at any footage you might have recorded. The damage is there, but whether or not it's actually worth building around is more a matter of perspective. So if damage isn't going to be the selling point for Crimson, then the only thing that really remains to give it an edge is Cruel Remedy. As I've already mentioned 1,000 times by now, Cruel Remedy excels with mob clusters and crowd clearing. It's got a generous impact and stability, as I've already said once, that makes it easy to hit crits, so maybe pairing the gun with a specific skill tree will allow it to shine just a little bit more. Specifically, Bottom Tree Gunslinger. There are two abilities that are really handy with Bottom Tree, and I think that using the gun without this skill tree puts the user at a distinct disadvantage, mostly because Cruel Remedy is factored in here as well. So let's do a quick discuss and I'll show you what I mean. Bottom Tree has Practice Makes Perfect, which speeds up the charge rate of your cast on critical hits, stacking on itself 5 times. Knock 'em Down stacks on a timer that caps at anywhere between 23 to 25 seconds, honestly I can't remember, forgive me. It comes from critical kills, and those kills add more time to the countdown, which in turn increase handling and stability, making it even easier to continually pound a target's crit point. The 3-round burst is what makes it useful here. Though the collective damage from a burst is divided into 3 numbers, Practice Makes Perfect generates a stack for each critical hit. The same thing can be accomplished with a pulse rifle on the bottom tree as well. And when I say pulse rifle, yes, I mean bad juju. It's awesome, you should use it. This is the best skill tree to pair Crimson with for a multitude of reasons, at least in my own opinion. For starters, it physically buffs the gun on critical kills, helping to compensate for its lower base handling. Even if you don't necessarily notice the lack of handling at first, it is there, and when Knock 'em Down is active and the timer is going, that lack of handling becomes painfully obvious. The stability buff is also a major boost as well. Anything that fires more than 1 round at a time can become a chore to control because of recoil deviation, and that's only going to get worse here when crossplay becomes a thing later this year. I imagine that we'll see a lot of Crimson being paired with Bottom Tree for those buffs alone after Bungie ruins our recoil stats. In essence, critical kills increase handling and stability for Crimson, which in turn makes it significantly less of a chore to try and hit a successful burst into a crit point, and those crits are going to generate stacks of practice as well, ultimately significantly decreasing the cooldown of your cast. This means that Golden Gun is available more often, which means that Nighthawk is a very viable exotic to pair with Crimson on a high int build. Would you look at that? Pair the right gun with the right skill tree and all of a sudden it's useful. Who'd have thought it? The difference in charge rate with and without Practice/Crimson is painfully noticeable, and after spending who knows how many hours just playing around with the gun, I can safely say that while it isn't necessarily my go-to gun, it is a great gun, and a viable one at that. All in all, I encourage anybody who isn't really big on hand cannons to just give it a whirl and see how they feel about it. Cruel Remedy isn't really the saving throw I wanted it to be, and I'm not big on burst weapons, but hey, if it fires bullets, I'll give it a shot. Pardon the pun. That closes out this video. We've got the start of a brand new season tomorrow. I've already got pre-scripts written out and recorded. You can expect to see a lot more from me in the coming weeks. You know the drill. I'll be in my cell.